The GoToWebinar screen, there is an area for chat and Q&A. At any point during the webinar, you can post a question, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. There's a survey at the end as you exit as well. That helps us know what topics you're interested in for future FP webinars. You will be receiving a copy of the webinar afterward to share with others in your organization. And then finally, on Twitter, you can leave any questions or comments by using hashtag Fpwebinar. So welcome, and thank you for joining us for moving and organizing enterprise content in the SharePoint Cloud. Our FP webinars are short and to the point. It'll be about a 20-minute presentation with 10 minutes for Q&A. During this webinar, we'll be covering a challenge most of you must be facing around getting your content to the cloud, from moving and organizing the content to creating a design strategy, exercising some best practices, along with some recommendations. During these FP webinars, we like to reach out to subject matter experts on the topics we are covering. As we focus today on content, we reached out to a team of content experts over at DocPoint Solutions, a trusted partner to Fpweb.net. Today we are joined by two industry veterans, Mike Radigan and Scott Money, who will take us through the presentation and share some of their experiences with us today. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Jill. On behalf of Quality Associates and DocPoint Solutions, our Quality Associates being our parent company, we want to say thank you to you and your team for working hard to put this information together and get it out to your combined customers as well as ours. Ryan Bort's on our side, so thank you, Ryan, for all your efforts. As Jill had mentioned earlier, we want to keep this presentation brief and to the point and share some of the many best practices that we've encountered over the last 20 plus years, Scott,
right,
in managing content with customers. With SharePoint being introduced just 7 or 8 years ago, it was an interesting migration for us. Our parent company, Quality Associates, has been in the enterprise content management for 20 years, and we have scanned upwards of 3 billion documents for federal and commercial customers. As SharePoint evolved, we began to realize that not only setting up and managing content in SharePoint is important, but understanding the way content moves throughout the enterprise becomes more and more important as SharePoint has become as large as it has over the years. So during the course of the next few minutes, Scott and I are going to kind of guide you through some of the best practices that we've learned over the years and hopefully help you and your team manage the migration of content from your existing enterprise to the SharePoint Cloud. But I think more importantly, why is this so important? I want you to think about your SharePoint enterprise as your house. All of us have, growing up, maybe you lived in an apartment and then you moved to a house, you got married, had children, etc. But you have to think about the migration of content as from moving from a house to a house. In your current house, when you're getting ready to move, you have to decide, what do I want to keep? What do I want to throw away? How do I want to organize the content so when I get to the new house, I'm not searching for it? And that takes a lot of planning and it takes a lot of time. Many people don't do that. And it's been our experience over the last 7 or 8 years in managing SharePoint projects that the migration and the management and the organization of content is oftentimes lacking with many of our customers. So in essence, the migration takes a lot longer than it should have, and customers still experience problems finding content once the migration is finished. So how do we help with that? Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've developed a design strategy which applies to broad SharePoint designs, but also applies specifically to migration plans. Before you decide what content is going to be migrated, you really have to make sure that your SharePoint enterprise in the cloud or on-premise, however you're migrating, has been designed properly. If you see at the top of this document, it all starts with a business need. It is very, very important and vital to the success that you involve the end user stakeholders in this process. This is not an IT project. It is a means to move content from one source to another. So you have to identify a sponsor, and you have to identify business users that are going to help you with the content. Within that, you need to do an analysis of all of that content. How do you want to organize, share, search, and manage all of that content once it's in its new location? That's extremely important. This is the part where you decide what I'm going to keep, what I'm going to throw away. Do I need to reorganize this? Do I need to create a separate or a new taxonomy? If you notice on the right of the screen, we have a governance and compliance plan. This is equally important to the success of this project. If you're moving to a new environment, we don't want to move the content and figure it out later. We want to talk about what is the governance surrounding this, and what is the compliance, who can add content, who can change content, who can modify content. All of that information becomes important. Most of the organizations that we work with, if we ask them for a governance and compliance plan for the new environment, Scott, what would you say? 10%, 20% have that approved?
I would say so, yeah. That's about right.
So you think about that. If you're moving this to a new environment, for those of you who have struggled with finding content in your current enterprise, this is the opportunity to get it fixed. Both of those flow into that solution design. You need to go through acceptance and testing and then implement this new solution. So keep in mind that the content migration is part of a larger solution. We don't migrate the content and then determine how we're going to use it later. It has to be part of a broad design. Another way to think of this, it's not like you're migrating SQL environments. You're not just going from an old SQL environment to a new SQL environment. You're really moving from your house to your house. Not just one room, it's the entire house that we're dealing with. A key to this on the side of that gray area in the middle, you'll see communications plan. If we involve those stakeholders early and often, we have to make sure that we communicate to them and let them know what's going on. If the content has been migrated, has it been successful? Can they find the content? If we engage them early and get stakeholder approval, then that's going to help us with our other migrations as we move across the enterprise. So what would we consider some of the best practices for planning a SharePoint content move? If we think of this as a train, we have IT at one end and we have business at the other. If we let IT drive that migration, we're not involving the stakeholders, but we have to thoroughly involve the stakeholders. And that's what we talked about earlier, is have the business needs drive the migration. What IT can do here is work with the business to say, listen, you have 500 gigs of content. Do we want to migrate all this content? What's important? What's not important? Do we need to move all of these sites over? Can we leave some of these sites? Can we archive some of these sites? All this information becomes important. By having the business drive that train, it's going to allow us to get sound business analysis and requirements. More importantly, we want to take all the feedback that is coming back from the business users and incorporate that into new releases. And we may have to do the migrations multiple times. This is going to increase your user adoption overall. And that's because key stakeholders that are involved in this are going to tell the other stakeholders how well the migration went. The other thing you want to try to do is create SharePoint evangelists. Understand the way people learn. You have young people in your organization, people that have been there a few years and people that have been there 30+ years. You need to involve all of them in this process because they all help to create the content and they're all going to be using the content. And more importantly, we need to make sure that the business challenges you had in the old environment are going to be solved in the new environment. We're not just migrating content for content's sake. So what would some of these best practices be? Scott?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So again, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So I'm going to kind of cover the next few slides, only 2 slides. We have a limited amount of time, but you're going to hear me refer back to the needs analysis slide that Mike discussed earlier just a couple minutes ago, because really the entire plan for using best practices is focused and references that slide and how you perform your needs analysis. Just to give you a quick overview, we've been very busy in the migration arena, especially over the last 9 to 12 months. We probably have about 30 or 40 migrations we've completed. And that includes everything from scanning backfile to migrating content from NAV storage into SharePoint from other content management systems such as some of the open text products, Stellan, and so on. So That being said, our experience goes back to when we used to manage content on microfilm, and some of you may laugh at that, but that's how far back we go. So. Anyway, so we're going to go ahead and run through the best practices, and these are just some things we've learned over the years performing these tasks. So we'll go ahead and start with creating content steering committees. This is obviously very important. It's a huge part of your migration plan. We find you always have to involve your users from the very beginning and have them as part of your steering committee, along with your members of your IT staff and your main stakeholders. The end users really, they represent the people who use these systems on a daily basis, and they obviously have a vested interest in the functionality of your solution. So always keep them in consideration, bring them in from day one, and I'll talk some more about the users' interaction in another slide here in just a minute. Building on that steering committee, communication, obviously always a key. You should have a communication plan identified during your needs analysis, and make sure everyone knows who has which role in this effort. Make sure they all know each other. So that makes everything easier as far as questions go, who will be handling which questions. Defining the content. So you heard Mike talk about this as well. We're kind of looking at each other because we're kind of covering some of the same things. But identifying the content that will be migrated, again, it's just like moving from one house to another. Many times we'll find that people just want to dump everything from one content management system into another. And what we see is oftentimes much of that data, we can just purge that and not even include it in the effort. Along with that, in that phase, also take into consideration what your day forward process will be. Sometimes we can alleviate some of those spreadsheets that are shared between 5 people. We've all seen that done before, but some of those items can be handled in workflows, so we may not even need to migrate those. Determining your site design, taxonomy, and governance. Referring to that business needs document again, we need to work with your steering committee and your stakeholders to figure out where these documents will be stored, how they'll be broken up into different libraries and subsites, and also always thinking about the future while we're doing that. Because we need to know who's going to have access to those documents. Maybe we're going to split these up a little bit differently. If you've had things in a network share especially, we need to make sure all that content, if it's sensitive, it needs to be identified and flagged that way. Adding metadata. Many content management systems we've seen only have, basically you can only search on the content. Sometimes that's all you need, and that's something else we identify in that needs analysis process. But if we need to add tags, we can do that. There's many different ways to do that. Concept search is one tool we've used in the past. Or we can even use the foldering levels. If there's a consistent foldering method that was used on the NAS device, on the NAS storage area, we can use that as well. We can break those up and actually import those into the metadata fields. Otherwise, if we're going to do, there's different ways to do that as well. We can export that content. You can process it through kind of a capture solution and apply the tags in that way, and then re-release to your new destination. Pilot migration. So during any project, excuse me, we always like to have these pilot phases pretty much for every site and sub-site that's going to be created in your new content management destination. And it's a great time to test out your tools. We've learned in the past that there's certain tools that are better suited for different migrations. They're always changing and evolving, so keep that in mind. We've been through a couple scenarios where we had one tool identified, found out halfway through that it may not be the best solution, and we've switched lanes, so to speak. So it's a great time. Those pilots are very important. It gets your proof of concept in line so everybody's on the same page, and they'll know what this solution is going to look like at the end of the day, especially your end users. Testing on different platforms. This kind of goes into making sure all the browsers that you're going to be using within your organization will support your solution. That also touches on your mobile phones or your tablets. If you're allowing remote access, many facilities do not, but everything behaves differently in different browsers. IE7, Google Chrome, those all need to be taken into consideration. If we have these types of devices identified that end users want to use in the future, what we typically do is pick a couple that will be supported. Don't leave it as in we can handle all mobile devices. Pick specific devices that you're going to allow your user to use, especially the same goes for your browsers, and those are IT rules as well. All right, so we'll move on to our next slide. So the implementation successes, and there we go. So planning ample time. This is always a big one. So based on the needs analysis, we create our project plan. Don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to get these migrations done. There's a lot of parties involved. Oftentimes your steering committee is involved with their daily routines, and this is kind of an extra task they're taking on. Don't underestimate that level of effort. Always, in the needs analysis, you'll be able to make that schedule, get your timeline, so you can establish your milestones and your deliverables to make sure everything gets done on time. It's better to give yourself a little extra rather than come up short and be fighting the clock at the end.
Especially as you move into the summer months now, you're dealing with vacations. You're dealing with kids getting out of school. There's so many other things in a project plan that tie into that. Kind of tied into that as well as scope creep. The more people start to see success, the more they're going to push back and say, oh, can I do this? Can I change this? You have to have a plan in place to accommodate that scope creep. So keep that in mind as well. Any plan you put in place oftentimes is going to have delays. If you include those delays in the plan, it's going to help meet the overall objectives of that executive sponsor and help get additional projects moving down the road as well.
Exactly. And yeah, the vacations, also the holidays always come into play with those as well. So let's see, meet with and provide support for end users. And this kind of references the training, which is sometimes overlooked, but training is obviously very crucial because even though we know what that end solution is going to look like, your end users have been involved from the beginning, so they're going to be familiar with the interface. It's very important to make sure they know how to use the list functions and the library functions up in the toolbar. The way they see it and they've seen it evolve, that's obviously very important because we don't want to do a training session where you put those users in front of that screen and it's the first time they've seen what it looks like. That usually ends up being an unsuccessful migration, and we've seen that in the past. So, it's very important, like we mentioned before, involve those end users and don't underestimate the training effort.
Keep in mind that all this should be focused on end user adoption. If you're migrating from an on-premise environment into the SharePoint Cloud, considering maybe even Azure or into Fpweb and a private cloud, if it's in Office 365, those products are different. They interact differently. So if people are used to looking for content in one way and on-premise, and they have to look for content a different way in the cloud, you need to make them aware of it. You need to manage the expectations and make sure they have the proper training around how they're going to use that content.
Exactly. Celebrating wins, lunch and learns. So in our busy schedules, we all know that we get involved with these projects. Sometimes the meetings can become a little monotonous. So we like to break up some of those meetings with lunch and learns. We do that quite often. It keeps everybody engaged, and plus it's free food. You don't have to pay for it. So, and celebrating the wins as well. When you reach milestones, it's great to do a little bit of a lunch, bring in some food, sandwiches. If it's a big milestone, you can take everybody out. But that goes a long way with appreciation for your employees and your team. And last but not least, the evangelist to show success to other divisions and groups. Being able to share a successful project is obviously very rewarding. If you have in hand your analysis document, your project plan, and your UAT documentation to make sure everything was tested thoroughly, everybody was involved in that process, it's a great tool to show off. And really, at the end of the day, most of all, you've improved the work process for the end users, and that's really what the intent of the entire project was designed for.
We like to call this the water cooler conversation. When all of us leave and the end users are left to kind of fend for themselves, if you will, they're going to talk amongst themselves. So if we have helped to manage that expectations and rank the order of those migrations with, we like to say, least risk, highest reward. If you have one that is a small amount of content, that's going to affect everybody. And we can create those evangelists. when we're not around and you're not around, those end users are going to talk to each other and say, hey, that went really well. We're excited about moving the rest of this content. We cannot stress how important that end user adoption is to this and how those evangelists and those stakeholders are going to help you celebrate success. Having said that, we're at the end of the general presentation. We wanted to keep this to 20 minutes. And from a hosting standpoint, if any of you haven't considered where you might move to the cloud, you may want to consider Fpweb. We worked with them for many years. I think they have close to 1,000 SharePoint hosted instances now. Very good, very dependable, very responsive, and very fast. On that note, Jill, I'll turn it back over to you, and perhaps we can talk and see if there's any questions that have come in that we might be able to answer.
Okay, we do have one question here. Are there any particular migration tools or recommendations to move from SharePoint 2007 to Office 365?
Good question. So, yeah, there's several. So typically, we always mention the AvePoint and Metalogix tools. And it depends, it kind of depends on how much content their licensing is different based on how much data you're going to be migrating. But just to name two off the top of my head, those are probably two of the most common that we use.
Can you talk
and
a little
actually,
bit?
I'm sorry,
ahead,
a little
Jill.
follow-up to that question was, we've experienced a limit of uploading 1 gigabyte an hour. Any suggestion on increasing the upload speed?
Actually, we've seen the same thing. The migrations do tend to be a little bit slow. And as far as the impact, you know, sometimes it's funny that the person asked that question because we saw the exact same thing in several instances. One of the batch jobs we set up would run really quick, and the next one may run a little bit slower. We're not sure if that's an issue with the crawl schedule. It's probably something that they already looked at, but we've seen the same thing, and why that slows down sometimes, we're not quite sure. But you know, we've learned over the years just to, when we do those migrations, even if it's only 30 gigs, we always allow ourselves extra time in our project plan to get that done. It's a great question.
Yeah, and actually to follow that up, one more is, how long does it take typically to migrate content?
That's an open question. So,
well, I think a differentiator when there would be, talk about if you're just migrating general content, like from a NAS or a SAN, versus content within SharePoint that may have custom web parts and a variety of things tagged to it. That has a direct tie on the time.
Yeah, and also the workflows. It depends, I guess, on how much you're migrating. Are you migrating everything, like Mike mentioned, the workflows, any customization, like you said, with the web parts? Obviously takes more time because we always make sure there's going to work. In 2013, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, we kind of test those first. That definitely pushes back our timelines. As far as migrations, like the actual data itself, we could probably follow up with you, and I can give you some metrics on how long it's taken us to do that in the past. But off the top of my head, it's really hard to answer that question. I know what you're looking for, but you know, it's hard to say. It varies from environment to environment.
There was one project we worked on about 18 months ago, was about 700 gigs of content. To give you a relative time frame, it took about 9 months for the customer to design the new taxonomy scheme to help us determine how to map the content, and it took us about 2 weeks running 24/7 to actually perform the migration. So it was 9 months of prep and 2 weeks of migration for 700 plus gigs of content. But if we hadn't done it that way, there would have been 700 gigs of somewhat unstructured content with the wrong taxonomy and metadata in the new system, and the user adoption would have been very poor. But as a result, the user adoption was high because the end users really took their time to determine what they wanted to keep. And the amount of content they had was well over a terabyte or 2 terabytes, but they actually reduced that by about 40 to 50% for the migration.
Okay, I guess that kind of ties into this last question. What do I do if I have a lot of historical content that doesn't have any metadata? Should I move it to the cloud, or what is your recommendation?
Okay, another great question. So that's something you probably want to kind of mention in the in some of the earlier slides. You talk about your records management policy, how long you have to actually keep that information. If it's not something you're going to use on a daily basis, you can maybe have a different subsite and put those records in that subsite. But if you're not going to need it, then don't migrate it. I would say export it to, we've done external drives before, just to keep an archived copy of it, or maybe put it back on tape. If it's outside of your records retention policy, then typically we say not to migrate it and just archive it on long-term storage media.
Another option to that is, we mentioned earlier a company called Concept Search, which you can Google them. They're a great company. But what they do, it was somewhat unique, is if you define the new taxonomy for the destination SharePoint site, then you can use that software to go back and review the existing content that you have to assign the appropriate tags. I guess one thought would be, if you haven't used the content, are you going to use it in the new environment? But if you know that you'd like to, and a lot of the users have experienced frustration with how it's been tagged before and delays in managing those searches, it'd be a good tool to check out. And they work hand in hand with SharePoint and the Records Management Center. And there's, again, as Scott mentioned, there's a variety of tools out there. I think the beauty of SharePoint is that if you concentrate on that end user adoption side, there's so many tools out there that can support, and there are more and more coming out every day. They continue to get cheaper and cheaper, but I think more importantly, they solve more of the problems that we're all talking about today.
Okay, great. Well, we do not have any more questions in the queue. So with that, we're going to end it just a couple minutes early, which is great. And I just wanted to thank DocPoint Solutions and Mike and Scott for sharing your experiences with us today. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And one last reminder to fill out the survey as you exit so that we know what you'd like us to cover in the future. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, goodbye, and have a great day.